Welcome. Tonight we drift back to the year 1692, to a quiet Puritan village in Massachusetts, where the air hung heavy with fear, and even silence felt dangerous. It began with strange behavior, and ended with neighbors turning against each other, as whispers of witchcraft spread like wildfire. In Salem, superstition ruled, and truth was lost in the fog of panic. If you enjoy calm journeys through the darker corners of history, consider liking this video and subscribing, so you can fall asleep to the past, night after night. So if you've come to rest in the dark, forgotten corners of history, close your eyes, let your thoughts slow down, and let the story begin. Long before the trials began, before gallows were built, and names were etched into history, Salem was just a village. Wooden homes stood close to quiet fields. Forests pressed in from all sides, and the sea whispered somewhere beyond the trees. The people who lived there were Puritans, seekers of order, faith, and discipline. They believed the world was a battle between good and evil, light and darkness, God and the devil. They woke with the sun, worked the land with bare hands, and prayed into the silence. Their days were filled with rules, their nights with scripture, and though they left the old world behind, they carried fear with them. Quiet fear that sin could live in the heart of anyone, a neighbor, a child, even themselves. So when strange things began to happen, in the cold winter of 1692, they didn't look for reason. They looked for witches, and in doing so, they looked inward and turned on each other. What followed was not just a series of trials, but a slow unraveling of trust, of truth, and of peace. Now we return to that winter, to where it began, in the home of a minister, with a child, who would not stop screaming. Salem village was small. Its people were fewer than 600. They knew each other's names. They shared fences, pews, and whispers. Their lives were simple but not easy, and their beliefs were heavy, deeply rooted in faith, in order, in fear of things unseen. It began as many things do, with something small. A child, a cough, a moment. Betty Parris, the daughter of Reverend Samuel Parris, had not been herself. She was 9 years old, quiet by nature, raised in scripture and silence. But in the cold heart of winter she began to change. She cried out during prayer. She fell into strange trances. Her limbs twisted and stiffened. She claimed to feel invisible needles, to see shapes no one else could see. Her cousin Abigail Williams soon showed the same signs. She too screamed. She too convulsed. And when the doctor could not find illness in their bodies, he gave them a different diagnosis: witchcraft. The word passed from mouth to mouth, soft as a breath. Witchcraft. A word that needed no explanation. A word that carried weight in every corner of Salem's belief. Other girls followed. Ann Putnam, Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, Elizabeth Hubbard. Each began to act strangely, as if the same invisible force had reached out to touch them. The town grew uneasy. The air felt colder, though the fire still burned. Mothers held their children closer. Men sharpened tools with silent worry. The afflicted girls claimed they were cursed. They said names. Not in courtrooms, not in crowds, but in quiet corners and firelit kitchens. They accused. The first to be named was Tituba. She was a servant in the home of Reverend Parris. She was not like the others in Salem. She had been taken from Barbados. Her voice carried a different rhythm. She told stories of spirits, not scripture. She sang to the fire when no one was watching. Next was Sarah Good, poor, homeless, muttering to herself as she walked the frozen roads, wrapped in cloth not thick enough to keep out the wind. Then Sarah Osborne, a woman who had not come to church in months, who had married outside her social class, who kept to herself. 3 women, different, quiet, alone. They were brought before authority, not with force but with certainty, questioned not gently but not with violence, asked what they had done, asked who else they had seen. Tituba, under pressure, confessed. She said yes. She said she had spoken with the devil. She said there were others. She said names. And that was all the people needed. The fear spread, like smoke, like frost, like breath in the cold. Salem village was no longer quiet. Doors closed a little faster. Eyes lingered a little longer. Voices whispered a little softer. Trust, once shared like bread at the table, began to fracture. In the meeting house, sermons grew more intense. The devil was among them, the ministers said. The battle had come home. This was not a story from Europe. This was not distant history. This was now. Children shivered beneath their blankets. Mothers stayed awake longer by the fire. Fathers checked the locks twice. No one knew what to do. But everyone knew what they feared. The afflicted girls were watched closely. When they screamed, people believed. When they pointed, people listened. When they accused, others followed. The snow kept falling. The fire kept burning. But the peace had gone. And no one knew if it would return. This was how it began. Not with proof. Not with clarity. But with fear. And fear does not need a reason. It only needs time. And in Salem, the winter was long. The wind moved slowly across the frozen fields of Salem. Snow still coated the ground in soft layers. The days were gray and short. The nights longer than memory. But in the homes of the villagers, something more chilling than winter had taken hold. Fear. It crept in through the cracks. It settled in the space between words. It echoed in glances, in hushed conversations, in the rhythm of footsteps behind closed doors. The girls, Betty Parris, Abigail Williams, and others, continued to convulse. Their cries grew sharper, their visions more detailed, their claims more direct, and they began to name names. 3 women were first. 3 names spoken in the quiet of Reverend Parris's home. 3 lives turned upside down in the flicker of a flame. The first was Tituba. She was a servant in the Parris household, taken from Barbados, foreign in speech and spirit. To the Puritans of Salem she was already different. Her stories were not the Psalms. Her voice was not soft and Puritan. She told tales of spirits, of colors and sounds that came from far away. She spoke of omens and visions. Sometimes she sang. She belonged to no one but was owned by a minister. She lived inside their home but never truly among them. When Betty and Abigail cried out that Tituba had bewitched them, it did not take much to make the village believe. A servant, a woman of color, from a distant place. She was summoned. Not by invitation but by command. She was questioned. Not in kindness but in control. What did she know of witches? Had she signed a book? Did she ride through the night with the devil? She denied. At first, she said nothing. She wept. She waited. But pressure is a silent tool. It squeezes without sound. It shapes without touch. Eventually Tituba confessed. She spoke of dark animals. Of a tall man in black. Of books signed with blood. Of other women who flew through the night. She said she had been forced. That she tried to resist. That she was afraid. And the people believed her. Not because she sounded truthful. But because she confirmed what they already feared. Her confession was long and vivid. Filled with details. Filled with everything a frightened village needed to hear. She had seen the devil. She had served him. And she was not alone. The next woman named was Sarah Good. She was poor. Very poor. She wandered from house to house, begging for scraps of food, for bits of warmth. She was thin, gaunt, and often muttered under her breath. When people refused her, she sometimes cursed them. Or at least they thought she did. Her clothes were torn. Her child hungry. Her presence unwanted. She was, in the eyes of the village, already fallen. She did not attend church regularly. She quarreled. She was impatient. She smoked a pipe. And she was seen often in places where women like her were not meant to linger. When the afflicted girls cried her name, people nodded. Of course, Sarah Good. A woman without place. A woman without grace. She was accused. She was questioned. And she denied it. She said she was innocent. She said they were lying. She said she had never harmed a soul. But her words meant little. Her life had already been written by others. And so she was bound. The third to be accused was Sarah Osborne. She had not been to church in a long time. She had married a man her neighbors did not approve of. She had tried to claim land that others believed did not belong to her. She was older. She was sick. She stayed indoors most days. But in a town where conformity meant safety, she stood apart. The girls cried her name. They said she came to them in dreams, that she poked them with pins, that her specter whispered curses into their ears. She too denied it. She said she was ill. She said she could barely rise from bed. She said she was no witch. But illness was not innocence, and silence was not safety. These three women, Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne, were the beginning, the first to face the rising tide, the first to stand beneath the weight of invisible evidence, the first to be believed guilty without proof. They were examined by local magistrates. Their words were recorded, their denials noted. But it was Tituba's confession that changed everything, because in that confession she did not say, "I acted alone." She said, "There are many." That one sentence, soft as it was, echoed through every room in Salem. Many. How many? Oh, where? She named no one else at first, but others would. The afflicted girls became central. Their visions became law. Their fits became warnings. Their screams, evidence. The adults watched in silence. The ministers prayed louder. The magistrates leaned in. The girls pointed. And with each accusation, the world tilted further from reason. The village no longer whispered. It spoke aloud. Neighbors looked sideways. Children cried out in church. Wives asked husbands if they had noticed anything strange. A ripple had begun. Small. Almost delicate. But it was growing. What began in one home spread to another. And another. The idea that witches walked among them was no longer a question. It was a fact. And facts, once believed, are hard to undo. Soon new names were added. Martha Corey, Rebecca Nurse, Dorcas Good. Each name brought a gasp. Each accusation sent another chill through the village. Rebecca Nurse was particularly shocking. She was elderly, respected, known for her kindness. But kindness does not protect against fear. The afflicted girls screamed at the mention of her name. They claimed her specter tormented them. They fell to the floor in her presence. They said she pinched them, pricked them, sent her spirit flying through locked doors. Rebecca denied it all. She prayed. She wept. She stood calmly. But the people were unsure. Could such a woman be a witch? If even the kindest could be guilty, who then was safe? Children began to accuse parents. Servants accused mistresses. Husbands doubted wives. And the girls kept screaming. The air in Salem had changed. It was heavier now. The snow still fell. But its silence no longer comforted. The fire still burned. But it no longer warmed. At night, people watched their windows. In the morning, they looked to the meeting house. They waited for the next name. Because in Salem, anyone could be a witch. And no one could prove they weren't. The first accusations had opened a door. And behind that door was chaos. But not loud chaos. Not fire and screaming. This was quiet chaos. The kind that walks softly. That hides behind the eyes of your neighbor. That smiles while it destroys. The kind that looks like truth, but is only fear. As the snow melted into spring, more names would follow. More arrests. More confessions. But it began here. With 3 women. 1 servant. 1 beggar. 1 widow. And with a village too afraid to wait. Too afraid to doubt. Too afraid to stop. People spoke more openly. They no longer whispered. Witches were real. Witches were here. And Salem, once a village wrapped in silent faith, was now bound in invisible chains of fear. In the center of it all stood a single voice. Tituba. She had confessed. And with her words, something powerful was released. Not a demon, not a spirit, but a story. A vivid, unfolding tale that wrapped itself around the minds of everyone who heard it. She had been questioned. By ministers. By magistrates. She had been watched, doubted, cornered. And then she spoke. She said she had seen the devil. She said he came to her not with horns or fire, but as a tall man dressed in black. He promised her things. He whispered offers. He held a book. A heavy, dark book with strange writing. A book she had touched. He asked her to sign her name. And she did. She said she had seen strange animals, a yellow bird, a red dog, a black cat. She spoke of flying through the night, of being pulled into dreams and darkness, of hearing voices no one else could hear. The villagers listened closely. Her words frightened them, but they also fascinated. Her story, strange and terrifying, fit neatly inside their fears. It gave shape to shadows. It turned suspicion into confirmation. And most importantly, Tituba said she was not alone. There were others. That simple phrase, "there are others," was like a spark dropped into dry grass. The fear that had grown quietly for months suddenly had direction. If there were others, who were they? Were they close? Were they watching? Anyone could be one. A neighbor, a cousin, a church elder, a child. The mystery was unbearable. And so, the village turned its gaze inward. Every twitch became a sign. Every look became a signal. Every silence a secret. The ministers asked her more questions. How many witches were there? She did not say. Did she know their names? Not yet. Could she recognize their faces? Perhaps. And the village waited. They waited to be named. They waited to be spared. They waited to know what was true, and who was not. Tituba's confession was strange in another way too. She said she had been forced. The devil had beaten her. He had frightened her. She had tried to resist. She had prayed. She said she never wanted to be part of it. That she had no choice. This mattered. Because if she had no choice, maybe others didn't either. Maybe the devil could trick anyone. Maybe no one was safe. For the villagers, this was both terrifying and comforting. It explained the unexplainable. Why did someone good act strange? Why did someone kind behave cruelly? Why did the children cry at night? It was not them. It was the devil, working through them. Tituba had opened the door. And behind that door was a world the Puritans feared more than anything. A world without control. A world without certainty. A world where evil wore familiar faces. After her confession, the magistrates took notes. They spoke in serious tones. They told the village what she had said. And the village believed her. She had no reason to lie, they thought. She had no power, they said. She was only a servant. And yet, her words held them all. The afflicted girls, too, seemed energized by her confession. They claimed to see more witches. They cried out in pain. They said they saw the devil's book. That they felt claws in the night. That spirits came to them in their sleep. Their performances grew more vivid, more theatrical. And people believed them. Because they wanted to. The ministers preached sermons filled with urgency. They read from scripture about devils, temptations, and the end of days. They warned the people to remain strong, to stay pure, to watch, to report, to confess if needed, and the people did. Some began to wonder aloud if they too had been influenced. They came forward with dreams, with visions, with suspicions, and more names were added to the growing list. Tituba herself was kept in jail. Though she confessed, she was not released. Confession brought survival, but not freedom. She was fed little. She was left in the cold. She was forgotten except when convenient. Yet her story lived on. It was repeated. It was reshaped. It grew like vines twisting around stone. Her confession also gave permission. Permission for others to confess, to accuse, to imagine. It gave weight to fear. It gave legitimacy to doubt. And in a village where fear had no shape, her story gave it one. A tall man. A book. A mark. A name. The question was no longer whether witches were real. The question now was, who would be next? Soon more people were arrested. More stories were told. The afflicted girls screamed louder. Magistrates leaned in further. And the fire that had been lit by one frightened woman's words kept burning. It warmed no one. It only consumed. Salem had changed. Could not go back. The snow continued to melt. The days grew longer. But the light did not return. Because a different kind of darkness had taken hold. One that could not be touched. One that came from within. And it had started with a story. A story told by a woman who said she was afraid. A story that felt true because it was feared. A story that gave voice to every silent terror the village held in its heart, and once told, could never be taken back. Spring came slowly to Salem. The snow melted in patches. The fields turned from white to brown, then green again. Trees awakened with the soft rustle of new leaves. But the village remained uneasy. The days grew longer. The sun stayed a little higher in the sky. But light did not return to Salem. Not fully. Not inside. Because fear had taken root. And now it began to grow. Tituba had spoken. Her words had moved like smoke through every home, every prayer, every quiet conversation. She had said what many already feared. She had confirmed the invisible. And she had said there were others. Now the search for them began. The afflicted girls kept pointing. Not just in private but in public. Not just in whispers but in cries. Their fits continued. Their vision sharpened. They named names. And the names spread. What had started with 3 women now became 10. Then 15. Then 20. The jails filled. Families wept. Neighbors turned away. Some pleaded. Some hid. Some began to believe they were next. The magistrates called formal hearings. Not yet trials. These were examinations. Held in meeting houses, in taverns, in any space large enough to hold a growing crowd. People came from nearby towns. From farms. From across rivers. They came to listen. To watch. To decide. But most of all, they came to feel safe. If the witches were caught, maybe the devil would leave. The accused were brought in one by one. Bound. Tired. Alone. Some were silent. Some prayed. Some wept. The magistrates asked questions. Have you made a covenant with the devil? Can you recite the Lord's Prayer without error? Who came to you in dreams? They were asked to explain marks on their bodies. To defend strange behavior. To name others. And often it did not matter what they said. Because the afflicted girls were present. And when the accused walked in, they screamed. They said they saw spirits. They cried out in pain. They said invisible hands choked them. And the room believed. These were not trials of law. These were performances of belief. And the villagers watched. Some believed every word. Others were unsure. But few dared to speak. Because doubt could sound like sympathy. And sympathy looked like guilt. One of the first hearings was of Martha Corey. She had spoken out against the accusations. She had doubted the girls. She was known for her intelligence. Her strength. But when her name was cried out, she too was arrested. She stood tall before the magistrates. She answered calmly. She asked for reason. But the girls fell into fits. They screamed her name. They pointed at invisible wounds. They said her specter struck them. And the people believed. Because seeing, even imagine seeing, was more powerful than words. Another was Rebecca Nurse. Elderly, respected, gentle. She had lived a life of kindness. She had helped the sick. She had prayed daily. But her arrest shocked the village. Could even she be a witch? Some doubted. But the girls cried out louder. And the doubt became quieter. She stood before the crowd. Her hands shook. Her voice trembled. She said she was innocent. But innocence was no longer protection. The examinations continued. One after another. Dozens. The girls screamed. The magistrates nodded. The people watched. And the list grew. Soon even children were accused. Dorcas Good, the young daughter of Sarah Good, was only 4 years old. She was questioned. She was jailed. Because she too had been named. And no one was too young. Not anymore. The ministers spoke with urgency. This was a holy war. They said the devil had entered the village. He had many servants. They looked like anyone. They smiled. They prayed. They walked among the righteous. And so everyone was watched. Every cough examined. Every word measured. And the people began to police themselves. They came forward with dreams. With suspicions. With confessions. Because silence was dangerous. And speaking might save them. Some confessed. Not because they were guilty. But because it might mean survival. A confession often led to mercy. A denial, to prison. Or worse. So some said yes. They had signed the book. They had flown through the air. They had seen the devil. And they were believed, because now belief was stronger than truth. The jails overflowed. Ipswich, Boston, Salem. Men and women packed into cold, damp cells. They were chained, fed little, left in darkness, and they waited for a verdict, for freedom, for anything. As spring turned towards summer, the governor of Massachusetts, William Phips, returned from war. He found a colony in chaos, and so a new court was created, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, to hear and to determine, to take the examinations and turn them into trials, and soon those trials would begin. But already Salem had changed, not by fire, not by war, but by fear, the kind of fear that grows slowly, that whispers instead of shouts, that wears a neighbor's face, the kind of fear that begins as protection and becomes destruction. The first trials were near, and with them, the first sentences, because now it was no longer about who was accused, but who would be condemned. Summer arrived in Salem. The sun lingered longer in the sky. The grass turned a deeper green. The air grew thick with heat, but the warmth did not calm the village. Instead, it grew hotter in a different way. The kind of heat that lives in the blood. The kind that burns beneath the surface. The kind called hysteria. The Court of Oyer and Terminer was now active. Trials were underway. Witnesses were called. Accused witches stood in crowded rooms, surrounded by eyes that did not blink. The afflicted girls cried out more than ever. Their fits became performances. They claimed spirits choked them in the courtroom. They said the accused sent animals to torment them. They fell to the floor. They screamed. They writhed. And the court believed them, because belief had replaced logic, and fear had become law. The list of the accused grew longer. More names, more families, more arrests. The jails were filled with farmers, housewives, widows, ministers. No one was immune. Wealth did not protect. Respect did not matter. Even those who had once been pillars of the village now stood accused. Giles Corey. He was an old man, strong, stubborn, known for his temper and his land. His wife, Martha, had already been accused. When Giles questioned the trials, he too became a suspect. He refused to enter a plea. He refused to confess. And in time he would pay a terrible price for his silence. But not yet. For now he waited, and watched the village unravel. Reverend George Burroughs. Once a minister in Salem, he had left years earlier. But his name was spoken by the afflicted. They said he was the ringleader, that he commanded witches from afar. He was arrested in Maine, dragged back in chains. The ministers prepared for his trial, because if a man of God could be a servant of the devil, then truly no one was safe. Deliverance Hobbs, John Willard, Sarah Wilds, one name after another, each accused by the same girls, each believed by the same court, and still the people came, to watch, to listen, to testify, some out of fear, some out of belief, some, perhaps, out of something darker. Accusation had become a weapon. Land disputes, old rivalries, jealousies and wounds from years past, all could now be settled with a single word, which the ministers warned of the devil's tricks. They said he could wear any face, that even the purest could be corrupted, that hesitation was danger, that doubt was weakness, and so few questioned, few resisted, even as the number of accused passed 30, then 40, then 50. Some confessed, not because they were guilty, but because confession spared the noose. They said what the court wanted to hear. They signed papers. They named others, and the storm grew. Some held firm. They denied everything. They quoted scripture. They prayed aloud, and they were sentenced, because in Salem now, to deny was defiance, and defiance could not be tolerated. The trials moved quickly, too quickly. Evidence was thin, but belief was thick. Spectral evidence, claims of spirits seen only by the afflicted, was accepted. A girl could say, "Her specter bit me," and that was enough. No mark was needed. No wound required, only the word, and a scream. Children watched their mothers taken. Husbands wept for their wives. Friends stood helpless as names were added to the list no one wanted to be on, the list that grew each day. Salem changed. The air was not just hot but tense. People avoided each other in the streets. Doors stayed shut. Curtains remained drawn. The church pews, once full of prayer and comfort, now echoed with suspicion. Innocence was no longer visible. It had no shape, no sound, no defense. Because when fear rules a place, nothing is safe, and no one is spared. The hysteria reached nearby towns. And over Topsfield, Ipswich, they too began to hold hearings. They too sent people to prison. The fear was contagious. It moved faster than logic, faster than truth. The ministers met in Boston. Some began to question. Was this too far? Were so many truly guilty? But in Salem the trials continued, because they had begun. And to stop would mean admitting they were wrong. And that was too much. The gallows were being built. Soon they would be used, because accusations were no longer enough. The people wanted justice. They wanted answers. They wanted punishment. So, they would have it, but it would not bring peace. Only silence. And not the kind that soothes. The kind that follows after something terrible. The kind that settles over a place where hysteria has done its work, and left nothing whole behind. At the center of Salem village, near the meeting house, stood the parsonage. It was a modest home, wooden, weathered, quiet. But inside lived a man whose voice carried weight. Reverend Samuel Parris, minister, father, landowner. And though few said it aloud, the spark that lit the fire. Reverend Parris came to Salem not by fate but by choice. He was a Harvard-educated man. Once a merchant in the Caribbean, he had turned to the ministry later in life. He brought with him a stern sense of order. He valued obedience, discipline, purity, and he believed, deeply, in spiritual warfare. The devil was real, and the devil was watching. When his daughter Betty and niece Abigail began to show signs of affliction, he was the first to respond. He did not see children in need of comfort. He saw a test, a battle, a trial of faith. He called for doctors. He called for ministers. He called for fasting, prayer, and scrutiny. And when the diagnosis of witchcraft was spoken aloud, he believed it immediately. He kept careful notes. He tracked the girls' behavior. He guided their stories, not through deception perhaps, but through conviction. He believed they were tormented, and he believed the source was not natural. And so, his fear became their focus. His certainty became their language, and his position gave their claims authority. Reverend Parris was not alone in his beliefs, but he was loudest. In sermons he warned of the devil. He read scripture of judgment, of fire, of punishment. He told his congregation that the enemy was near, that sin was in the room, that only vigilance could save them. His words landed hard, because they came from the pulpit, because they echoed what many already feared, because they left no space for doubt. The village had already been uneasy. Disputes over land, over wages, over who owned what. Parris had made enemies. Some did not trust him. They resented his salary. They questioned his leadership. But once the trials began, his voice gained power. He was no longer just a minister. He was a guardian, a guide through the darkness. At least that's how it seemed. Parris supported the girls. He stood behind their accusations. He defended them when others raised questions. He cited scripture. He wrote letters. He met with magistrates. He became part of the process, not as a judge, but as a voice. A steady, unwavering voice that said, "This is real." And in a time of uncertainty, that was all the people needed. His sermons grew sharper. He spoke of wolves in sheep's clothing, of false piety, of devils hidden behind kind smiles. He did not name names, but the people could guess, and that was enough. As the list of accused grew, Parris's role expanded. He advised the court. He reminded the judges of their duty. He encouraged the girls to speak boldly, and when dissenters arose, those who questioned the process, Parris stood firm. He called doubt dangerous. He said unity was strength, that to question the trials was to aid the devil, and few dared to argue. The parsonage became a place of fear, a place where spirits were said to torment, where girls screamed in the night, where prayers were offered without end, and all of it under Parris's roof, all of it beneath his gaze. Some began to wonder, was this all too much? Had fear gone too far? But Parris pressed on. Even as respected members of the village were arrested, even as families were torn apart, even as his own niece became more entangled in the hysteria. He believed he was doing God's work. He believed he was saving souls. But belief, when unchallenged, can become something else, something harder, something colder, something that sees doubt as danger, and disagreement as sin. In time, his influence would be questioned. When the trials ended, when the gallows were empty, when the village began to heal, people would look back and see his hand in everything. But in the heat of that moment, in the rising panic, he stood tall. He did not waver. He did not bend. And because of that, neither did the fire. The role of Reverend Samuel Parris was not just that of a father or a minister. He was a symbol of certainty in chaos, of order in fear, and perhaps of how even the best intentions can light the path to something unforgivable. The court of Oyer and Terminer was unlike anything Salem had ever seen. It was not a quiet meeting in the church, not a private gathering of elders. It was a public stage, wooden tables, scrolls of law, judges in dark robes, and a room filled with eyes, watching, waiting, believing. The court was created by Governor William Phipps. He had returned from war to find the colony unraveling. The jails were full. The people were restless. So he gave them a court, a place to hear the accusations, to determine guilt, to restore order. But the court did not bring peace. It brought something else: finality. Presided over by Judge William Stoughton, the court accepted all evidence, even the kind no one could see. Spectral evidence, a claim, a vision, a scream. That was enough. If a girl said, "She sent her spirit to pinch me," it became truth. No one could see the spirit, but they could see the fear. And fear in that room was louder than proof. Witnesses came forward. Some spoke of strange dreams, some of dead livestock, some of unexplained illness. They linked these things to names, to neighbors, to enemies, and the names turned to arrests, the arrests to trials, and the trials to death. The accused stood alone. Few had lawyers. Few had voices. They were asked to defend the unseen, to explain why a girl screamed when they entered the room, to deny words they had never spoken, to justify dreams that were not their own. And when they failed, the court wrote their guilt in ink. Some judges hesitated. They asked for more evidence, for signs, for witnesses, for patterns. But most did not, because to question the court was to question the church, and to question the church was to stand beside the devil. The trial spread, not just in location, but in reach, from Salem to Andover, to Topsfield, to Ipswich. Each town began to hold its own hearings. Each town added names to the growing list. The panic traveled like wind, invisible, undeniable. The gallows were built on Proctor's Ledge, a quiet hill, just beyond view, not too far, not too near, enough distance to avoid disturbing the town, but close enough to feel the weight of every step. Those found guilty were sentenced, not to prison, to death, by hanging. The executions were not loud. They were orderly, planned, public. A rope, a cart, a prayer, and silence. The court recorded each name, each confession, each denial, each sentence. The scrolls grew longer, the jail cells fuller, the line between justice and fear thinner, until it was no longer there at all. Friends of the accused were questioned. Family members examined. Some fled. Some confessed to crimes they had never committed, because confession meant life, and truth often meant death. Judges worked long hours, reading, listening, pronouncing. They believed they were purging evil. They believed they were doing God's work. They did not see themselves as punishing the innocent. They saw themselves as protectors. And protectors do not stop. Letters were sent to Boston. Some ministers began to raise concerns. They asked if so much spectral evidence was wise, if so many confessions could be trusted, if the devil might be tricking them all. But these questions were soft. The court's voice was louder, and the executions continued. Names once respected now lined the records. John Proctor, George Burroughs, Martha Carrier. Each faced the court. Each spoke in defense. Each was condemned. The trials were swift, and the sentences irreversible. People came to watch, not to celebrate, but to witness, to see justice served, to see evil punished. But what they saw was only fear, wrapped in the robes of order, bound by the language of law. The court sat beneath a banner of righteousness, but its shadow stretched long, and in that shadow, no one was safe. By autumn, whispers began to change. Some people no longer looked at the accused. They looked at the judges. They asked, how many more? How much longer? When will it stop? But the court still listened to the screams, still believed the visions, still followed the script it had written, page after page, sentence after sentence, until even truth could not be heard over the sound of fear. And the court, once built to bring peace, had become the very heart of the storm. The trials did not just happen in courtrooms. They happened in kitchens, in fields, at dinner tables. They happened in whispers, in glances, in silences that once held warmth. Because fear is not confined to walls or robes or verdicts. Fear lives in people. And in Salem, fear lived everywhere. Children no longer laughed as they once had. Their games changed. They mimicked the afflicted girls. They accused each other in play. They cried out in mock fits. What had once been innocence became imitation, and no one quite knew where the line was. Fathers no longer trusted sons. Mothers feared for daughters. Neighbors kept their distance. Doors stayed shut, not because of weather, but because of suspicion. The village that had once shared bread and labor now shared doubt. Some families were split. One member accused, the others unsure. What to say, what to believe, what to fear more, the accusation, or being next. The jails were crowded, not just with strangers, but with familiar faces. A midwife, a farmer, a cousin, a friend. Those who had once stood in the same pew, now stood on opposite sides of justice, or what was being called justice. Food grew scarce. With many imprisoned, work slowed. Fields lay untended. Children went hungry. Trade suffered. And yet the trials went on, as if nothing else mattered, as if the only harvest that year was fear. Some wept, not in public, but at night, in beds too empty, in homes too quiet. They wept for wives, for sons, for lost friends and stolen peace. Ministers preached louder. Some called for more faith, others more caution. A few began to question, but softly, because in Salem even questions had weight, and the wrong words could become a sentence. The gallows were not just wood and rope. They were a symbol, a presence, a reminder that silence was not safety, and speech could be a blade. People prayed more often, not always out of faith, but out of fear, out of desperation. They asked for forgiveness, for clarity, for the storm to pass. But the storm had settled in, and it was not ready to leave. The impact was not sudden. It was slow, a wearing down of the spirit, a soft breaking, not with shouts, but with quiet resignation, a slow forgetting of what peace had once felt like. Families stopped speaking to each other. Long friendships ended. Weddings were postponed. Babies were born in silence, and graves were filled. without the comfort of truth. Some people fled, left Salem behind, took their names and their fear and disappeared into other towns. Others stayed, not because they believed, but because they had no choice. They waited, they watched, and they hoped. Hoped that reason would return, that the screams would quiet, that the names would stop, that the rope would fall silent. But hope in Salem was a fragile thing. It flickered, it faded, it was passed quietly from one hand to another, like a candle, barely lit. Some found ways to resist. They wrote letters. They prayed more deeply. They spoke in circles behind closed doors. But resistance was not loud. Not then. It was a whisper, a look, a shared glance that said, "You too." The people of Salem changed. They became more cautious, more private, more distant, because when fear lives too long in a place, it takes root. It settles in the soil, and even when the storm passes, the ground is never quite the same. The trials would not last forever, but their shadow would, because what had been done could not be undone, because what had been believed could not be unthought, because what had been feared had changed the people and the place forever. This was the true cost, not just the lives lost, but the trust broken, the friendships fractured, the faith shaken, the hearts silenced, the people remade, not by the devil, but by each other. And in time the village would see, would reflect, would grieve, but not yet, not while the trials still echoed, not while the names still fell from lips like prayers, not while fear still sat, quietly, in every home. The summer air hung heavy over Salem. The fields were green, but no one spoke of the harvest. The sun still rose and set as it always had, but shadows now stretched longer than before, not from the trees, but from within. And in the middle of this uneasy stillness stood a name that carried weight, a name that should have stood above suspicion: Rebecca Nurse. She was old, in her 70s. Her hands were lined from years of work, her eyes soft, her voice quiet. She had lived in Salem for decades. She had raised children, prayed in church, offered help to neighbors without hesitation. She had never raised her voice, never sought conflict, never once in all her life been called dangerous, until now. When her name was spoken by the afflicted girls, a hush fell across the room. It was not a gasp of surprise, but of confusion, of discomfort, of disbelief. Rebecca? Surely not. Surely someone else. But the girls insisted. They said her spirit pinched them, that she came in dreams, that her shape floated above their beds like smoke. They cried in her presence. They fell to the floor. They begged the court to save them from her. And the court listened. Rebecca was arrested, dragged from her home, led in chains through the village she had served. Some watched in silence, some wept, and some turned away, because to look at her was to see something that did not fit. She was not poor, not rebellious, not foreign, not strange. She was respected, which made her arrest all the more unsettling, because if Rebecca Nurse could be accused, then who was safe? Rebecca stood before the court. She did not tremble. She did not scream. She did not beg. She stood, quietly, firmly, like a tree that had survived many winters. The magistrates asked her questions. They were not cruel, but they were not kind. They asked about the devil. They asked about her neighbors. They asked about the girls who claimed to suffer. She answered calmly. She spoke of her faith. She denied all charges. The afflicted girls cried out when she spoke. They said her words cut their skin. They fell to their knees. They covered their ears. And still Rebecca stood. She did not try to explain their fits. She did not try to argue. She simply said, "I am innocent." Outside the court, the village whispered. Some still believed her good. Others doubted their own doubt. The line between belief and fear had blurred. Faith no longer brought peace. It brought division. The religious divide grew deeper. Some ministers still supported the court. They preached of vigilance, of holy war, of sin among the saints. Others began to hesitate. Privately, cautiously, they questioned the girl's visions. They questioned the devil's reach. But they did not speak loudly. Not yet. Because a voice raised against the court might be a voice raised against God. Rebecca's trial moved slowly. There were no signs, no marks, no books signed in blood, just words, and cries, and fear, and silence. Her family spoke on her behalf. Her neighbors too. They said she was kind. They said she was honest. They said she was faithful. They said she was no witch. But the court had heard that before. And still, the gallows had been used. At first she was found not guilty. Pause. A breath. A flicker of relief. But then, confusion. The afflicted cried out. The court reconsidered. And the verdict was reversed. Guilty. One word. That changed everything. One word. That silenced the room. Rebecca said nothing. Not anger. Not sorrow. She simply stood still. And turned her face to heaven. After the verdict, Salem changed again. Not suddenly. Not loudly. But like the turning of a season. Soft. Inevitable. Unseen until it was already here. Some people began to speak. Not with shouts. But with questions. How could a woman like Rebecca be guilty? How could cries from children outweigh years of faith? How could justice be served when mercy was silent? Ministers met behind closed doors. Some defended the court. They said no one stood above suspicion. Not even saints. Not even elders. Not even the kindest soul. But others lowered their heads. They began to doubt. Not loudly. Not in sermons. But in thoughts they dared not yet speak. Rebecca was taken back to her cell. The walls were bare. The floor cold. Her hands trembled from age, not fear. She prayed. Not for herself. But for the village. For the judges. For the children who screamed. For the church that could no longer see itself. Outside, her family wept. They begged for her release. They wrote letters. They offered petitions. They reached out to friends, to ministers, to the governor. But the verdict stood. The rope was prepared. She was not alone in that cell. Others waited too. Men and women once respected, once believed, now reduced to names on a list. But even among them, Rebecca remained different. She did not curse. She did not despair. She whispered psalms. She remembered each of her children by name. She forgave those who condemned her. And when others cried out, she held their hands. The church divided quietly. Some parishioners stayed loyal to Reverend Parris. They called the trials a divine test. They believed the afflicted were chosen. But others stopped attending. They left pews empty. They walked away from sermons that no longer soothed. The community fractured along unseen lines. Not drawn in chalk or stone, but in belief, and in silence. When Rebecca's day came, the town held its breath. She was led gently. Her steps were slow. Her voice soft. She did not struggle. She did not plead. Only once did she pause. She looked to the sky. The clouds moved slowly overhead. And she said, "Lord, forgive them. They know not what they do." She was hanged on Proctor's ledge. Her body was buried in a shallow grave like the others. No stone marked the place. No prayer was spoken. Only the wind. Only the quiet. Only the long shadow she left behind. In the days that followed Rebecca's execution, Salem did not rejoice. There were no celebrations. No relief. Just quiet. Heavy, aching quiet. The kind that doesn't lift for a long time. The kind that settles into the bones of a place. Her death did not end the trials. The gallows would be used again. But something had shifted. Her name, so gentle, so rooted in goodness, had unsettled even the faithful. Some villagers began to meet in secret. They spoke softly. They questioned what had happened. Not to start rebellion, but to recover sense. To find reason again. They did not use Rebecca's name often. It was too painful. Too pure. Too recent. But her memory hung in every silence. In every hesitant glance between neighbors. Children no longer played freely in the fields. Their laughter, once common, now rare. Parents watched them differently. Watched their words. Watched their games. Watched the way fear had made its way into innocence. Some of the afflicted girls grew quiet. Their performances slowed. Their cries became fewer. Even they seemed changed. As if they too had seen something in Rebecca's eyes that they could not forget. The divide in the church grew wider. People who had once broken bread together now sat apart. Some left altogether. Not just the meeting house, but the village. They carried guilt with them, and shame, and questions that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Reverend Parris still preached, but his voice no longer held the same weight. His words no longer filled the room the way they once had. He spoke of vigilance, of sin, of the dangers that still lurked in the shadows. But fewer people listened. Fewer still believed. And in time, something rare happened. Whispers turned into letters. Letters into debates. Debates into confessions. Not from the accused, but from those who had accused. From judges. From witnesses. From ministers. They admitted doubt. Some asked forgiveness. Some stepped down from office. Others fasted. Others wept. Years later, the government would offer public apologies. Some of the accused would be exonerated. Land returned. Records corrected. But none of it would change what had happened. And none of it would bring Rebecca Nurse back. Her family never forgot. They found her body. They buried it in secret. In their family land, among the trees and fields she had once walked. They placed a simple stone. Nothing grand. Just a name. A date. And the truth the court had denied. O Christian martyr who for truth could die. That truth outlived the rope. It outlived the gallows. It outlived the court and the storm it carried. Rebecca Nurse was only one among many, but she became more than a victim. She became a mirror. In her silence, the people saw their own noise. In her peace, they saw their own panic. In her faith, they saw how far they had strayed. And slowly as the years passed, Salem began to change. Not all at once. Not with loud declarations. But softly. Like snow melting in spring. Like leaves returning to branches. Like forgiveness whispered into the dark. Rebecca's legacy was not in words. It was in what she didn't say. What she didn't become. She didn't curse. She didn't fall apart. She didn't turn bitter. She stood. Until the end. And in doing so, she reminded Salem what it had lost, and what, perhaps, it could still become again. He sat in silence. Not always. Not in court. But in the hours before dawn, when the candles flickered low and the quill rested dry on his desk, Judge Samuel Sewall sat still, and listened. To the wind. To his thoughts. To the echoes of voices he had heard in court. Not the accused. But the accusers, the girls, their screams, their sobs, their words that had changed everything. Sewall was not the most feared judge, not the loudest, not the most rigid, but he was present. He had signed the orders. He had heard the cases. He had watched the gallows rise and fall, again and again. He was a man of law, but also a man of faith. He believed in order. He believed in scripture. He believed in duty. And duty in Salem meant judgment. When the trials began, he listened carefully. He trusted his colleagues. He trusted the ministers. He trusted the process. He did not rush, but he did not stop it either. He accepted the evidence, spectral or not. He heard the cries. He watched the afflicted collapse in court. He recorded their words. And he sentenced the accused. Because that was his role. Because fear had made it so. Sewall was not unkind, but he was caught. Between belief and doubt. Between truth and obedience. Between justice and something else. In the early months he stood firm. He believed the devil worked through deception. That witches could hide in plain sight. That denial could be proof. That silence could be guilt. He was not alone. Many judges believed the same. Many ministers supported them. The community cheered their decisions. At first. But then came names like Rebecca Nurse. and John Proctor, and George Burroughs. Good people. Respected people. And still the girls cried out. Still the court condemned. Still the gallows were used. Sewall wrote in his diary. He recorded the trials. Not every detail, but enough. Enough to remember. Enough to reflect. He watched the fear grow. He watched the village divide. He saw neighbors accuse neighbors. Friends doubt friends. He saw children imitate the afflicted. He saw ministers question, quietly. And still the court sat. And still the rope held. He began to hesitate. Not with words, but with thoughts. He began to wonder. Had they been wrong? Had fear outpaced truth? Had duty turned into harm? He spoke less in court. He listened more. He asked questions others avoided. He requested more proof. He watched the girls closely. He looked for signs. Not of witchcraft, but of performance, of mimicry, of imagination shaped by power. When George Burroughs stood on the gallows and recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, Sewall paused, because the lore had said witches could not do so, and yet Burroughs had. Clearly, calmly, completely. The people watched. Some wept. But the execution went forward. Sewall did not stop it, but he did not forget. He wrote again that night. Long pages, full of questions, full of doubt. He asked God for guidance, for clarity, for peace. But peace would not come easily. Not in Salem. Not yet. When the trials began to lose momentum, when ministers in Boston raised louder objections, when the governor dissolved the court, Sewall felt something shift. Not relief, but reckoning. He stood in church, on a cold winter day, before the congregation, before the God he served, and confessed. He said he was sorry, for his role, for his silence, for his belief in things he could not see, for signing his name to fear. He stood, not as a judge, but as a man, as a soul, and asked for mercy. Others heard. Some followed. Some resisted. But Sewall's voice mattered, because it was not a cry of innocence. It was an admission that fear had risen, that it had used their hands, and that it had taken lives. He fasted, each year. On the day of his confession, he wore black. He prayed, not for redemption, but for remembrance, because forgetting was the most dangerous thing of all. Judge Samuel Sewall did not stop the storm, but he named it, and in doing so, he helped begin the quiet work of healing, of rebuilding, of trusting again, not blindly, but carefully, softly, in the hope that fear would not rise so easily next time, and if it did, that someone would have the courage to stand. The hill was quiet. It stood just beyond the edge of town, not far enough to be forgotten, not close enough to be part of daily life. They called it Proctor's Ledge. Rough ground, sparse trees, stone beneath the soil. And there, in that space between forest and field, between town and sky, the gallows were raised, not with ceremony, not with pride, just wood, and rope, and purpose. The executions began in June. The first was Bridget Bishop. She was outspoken, dressed in colors too bright for Puritan taste. She had been accused before years earlier, and now her name returned. She denied everything, but the court did not believe her. The girls cried out. The judges ruled. The rope was tied, and the cart rolled toward the hill. People came to watch, some from duty, some from fear, some from curiosity. They stood in silence as she climbed the steps. She looked out at the faces she had known. No priest stood beside her. No prayer was offered. Only the wind, and the rope, and then she was gone. The executions did not stop there. In July, 5 more were hanged. Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, Sarah Wilds, Rebecca Nurse. Each name carried weight. Each one had denied the charges. Each one had faced the court. Each one had stood on that hill. And each one had fallen. The gallows became a presence in the village. A shadow, not always seen, but always known. It stood in the back of people's thoughts. It followed them to bed. It watched from the corner of every sermon. It whispered, "You could be next." In August, 5 more. George Burroughs, Martha Carrier, George Jacobs, John Willard, John Proctor. Some were ministers. Some were farmers. Some were husbands. Each stepped onto the platform. Each prayed. Each spoke words no one would forget. George Burroughs stood tall. He recited the Lord's Prayer. Perfectly. Calmly. It was said witches could not do so. And yet he did. The crowd paused. Even the judges hesitated. But the sentence remained. And the rope was pulled. John Proctor, once a loud critic of the trials, died without apology. He had begged for justice. He had spoken of mercy. He had asked the court to see clearly, but they did not. He went to his death with dignity, with defiance, with faith. The executions were not quick trials. They were events. They took hours. From the moment of sentencing to the moment the body was buried. Every step was heavy. Every pause filled with questions. Is this justice or fear? Is this righteousness or revenge? The dead were not honored. No stones were placed. No prayers offered. They were buried in shallow graves. Some in crevices. Some in secret. Families searched at night. Some retrieved bodies. Carried them home under cover of darkness. Laid them to rest in hidden corners of their land. Not with ceremony, but with love. With sorrow. With shame. By September, the fear began to slow. The governor had dissolved the court. But the executions did not stop at once. 8 more were sentenced. 8 more hanged. Until the voices grew too loud. Until the ministers could no longer agree. Until even the judges stepped back. And the gallows fell quiet. 19 people hanged. 1 pressed to death. More than 100 jailed. And a village changed. Not in blood alone, but in spirit, in silence, in all the things that were no longer said. The gallows were taken down. The wood used elsewhere. The rope discarded. The hill returned to quiet. But the shadow remained. For years. For generations. In stories. In memories. In the hearts of those who had watched and wept. The executions did not destroy Salem. But they reshaped it. They reminded it of something cruel. That fear can wear the robes of justice. That law can carry trembling hands. That belief, when too certain, can forget compassion. The gallows no longer stand, but the place still exists, now marked, now named, now remembered, so that the silence of those who died there can speak again, softly, to remind us that even the quietest voice can tell the truth, even when no one wants to hear it. The storm did not end with thunder. It ended with a whisper, soft and certain. Like fog lifting in the early morning. It had taken months to build, but only days to fall apart. By late September of 1692, the village of Salem was tired, not just in body, but in soul. The jails were full. The gallows had been used again and again. Too many names. Too many accusations. Too many tears. And slowly, the people began to turn. It began with questions. Small ones. Whispered at night. Why so many? Why the good, the kind, the faithful? And then came the doubts. Spoken carefully. How could Rebecca Nurse be a witch? How could George Burroughs pray so clearly on the gallows? And then, silence. Not from fear, but from realization that something was deeply wrong. The ministers in Boston had grown louder. They wrote letters. They questioned the use of spectral evidence. They asked if the devil might be deceiving the court itself. And those words found ears in power. Governor Phipps listened. He had seen the fear take root. And now he stepped in. On October 29th, he dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer. The court that had sentenced so many. That had accepted dreams as truth. That had listened to screams over facts. Was now no more. Trials would still happen. But they would be slower. Careful. More skeptical. And with each passing week, the cries of the afflicted grew softer, the accusations fewer, the energy fading. Some who had confessed now tried to take their words back. They said they were pressured, afraid, confused. Some who had accused now lowered their eyes. They avoided questions. They avoided mirrors. They avoided the gallows they had filled. Winter came. The snow returned. The wind quieted the fields. And the village tried to breathe again. But breath was heavy. The kind that catches in the throat. The kind that tastes of guilt, of sorrow, of things that cannot be undone. Those still in jail waited. Some were released. Some waited months longer. Trials continued into the new year. But few convictions followed. The court, now reformed, demanded more than stories, more than shadows. And when shadows were all that remained, they let them go. The hangings had stopped, but no one celebrated. There were no cheers, only quiet, the kind that fills a home after mourning, the kind that follows the truth. Sewall stood in church. He confessed his sorrow, his guilt. Others followed. Not all, but enough. Enough to begin something new. Reflection. Parris, the minister who had stood at the center, began to lose support. Some left his church. Others wrote against him. He stayed for a time. But his voice no longer held the same weight. And eventually, he left Salem behind. In the years that followed, the colony declared a day of fasting, of prayer, of remembrance. They apologized publicly. They paid restitution to families. Not enough, but something. Something to say, we were wrong. The names of the accused were slowly cleared, one by one. Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, Martha Corey. The list grew, until nearly all were restored, at least in record, but no parchment can erase memory, or grief. The final days of the Salem Witch Trials did not bring closure. They brought awareness. That fear can grow where belief is unchecked. That power can be misused even with good intentions. That justice is not loud. It is careful, patient, slow. And that truth, though often drowned in noise, will return if we make space for it, if we listen, if we learn, and if we remember. So the trials ended. The storm passed. The snow melted. The village moved on. But the lessons remained, not carved in stone, but carried in story, in silence, and in the hope that the next time fear knocks, someone will have the courage to say, no. The trials had ended. The courts were silent. The gallows taken down. But Salem was not healed. Not yet. Because fear leaves marks deeper than ropes. It lingers in memory, in glances between neighbors, in the quiet between prayers. Those who survived returned home. They walked back through doors that had once opened in peace, now creaking from disuse, from dread. Some returned to empty chairs, to fields overgrown, to homes changed, and they began again, not with celebration, but with slow, careful hands. The families of the dead mourned, some in silence, some in prayer, some in protest. They told their stories. They kept the names alive. Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, Martha Carrier, George Burroughs. Names not of shame, but of strength. Names that reminded the village of who they had lost. The ministers preached repentance, not fire, not fear, but humility. Some fasted, some confessed, some resigned. Reverend Parris tried to continue, but his voice was no longer trusted, and in time he left. A new minister came, younger, softer. He did not bring sermons of doom. He brought listening. He let the people speak. He opened the doors of the church to questions, to confession, to grief, and slowly the pews began to fill again. The colony passed new laws. No more spectral evidence. New standards for justice. Juries with clearer rules. Judges reminded to wait, to question, to pause. The court had moved too quickly. Now they would move with care. Land was returned. Prison debts forgiven. Families compensated. Not much, but enough to say, we remember, we regret, we will not forget. Children grew up. They heard the stories. They asked their parents, "Did you believe it? Were you afraid? Did you speak out?" And the parents answered slowly, sometimes with shame, sometimes with tears, sometimes with long silence, because some questions have no easy answers. The trees grew taller. The fields were planted again. The river flowed as it always had. But Salem had changed, not just in name, in soul. The gallows were gone, but the hill remained. Children would point and whisper. Elders would turn away. Some returned at night, to pray, to place stones, to remember. The village learned to speak softly again, to trust carefully, to listen without jumping to fear. Healing was not a moment. It was a process, a season that came slowly and stayed. The names of the accused were cleared, formally, publicly, not all at once, but eventually nearly all. The governor signed the declarations. The courts recorded them. Families held the papers, not with pride, but with relief. In time, even the church held a day of remembrance, not of punishment, but of prayer, of healing, of resolve. That fear would not be allowed to rise that way again. That faith would be paired with reason, and that justice would be slow, patient, and kind. Salem did not forget, and that was its healing. Not in pretending it never happened, but in remembering it did, and promising, never again. Fear is a powerful thing. It moves quietly. It hides behind good intentions. It wears familiar faces, and when it takes root, it can reshape an entire world. The Salem Witch Trials were not born of hatred. They were born of fear. Fear of the devil. Fear of the unknown. Fear of being wrong. Fear of being next. And when fear grows unchecked, it consumes reason. It silences doubt. It turns questions into crimes. The people of Salem were not evil. They were human. They wanted safety. They wanted justice. They wanted peace. But in their search, they lost something deeper. Mercy, patience, perspective. The trials taught many things, some written in law, some etched in silence, some only understood years later, when the last echoes had faded and the grief remained. One lesson was this: belief is not enough. Belief must be questioned, tested, balanced, because belief alone can build gallows. Another lesson: justice must be careful. It must be slow. It must be humble. It must listen more than it speaks, because once justice moves too fast, it becomes something else, something colder, something cruel. The trials also taught this. Power must be held with care, whether it is the power of the pulpit, the bench, the pen, or even a single spoken word. It must be held with awareness, because power in the hands of fear can destroy even the innocent. And finally, silence matters. The silence of those who stood aside, the silence of those who doubted, but said nothing. Silence is not always safety. Sometimes it is surrender, and history remembers both. The Salem Witch Trials became more than a story. They became a warning, a mirror held to every generation, to ask, will we watch carefully? Will we question what we believe? Will we protect the quiet voices, or silence them again? In schools, children would one day learn the names. They would read of Rebecca Nurse, of John Proctor, of the girls who screamed, and the judges who listened. They would be asked what justice means, what fairness looks like, how fear hides in systems, and in speech, and they would answer in their own way, with essays, with questions, with stories. But in Salem, the story was not a lesson. It was life. It was grief. It was something felt, not just taught. And for many, it became a quiet promise, to speak when others do not, to doubt when others rush, to pause when the crowd pushes forward. The people of Salem carried that promise forward, not always perfectly, but honestly, in memory, in tradition, in quiet reflection. They built something new, from the ashes of fear, awareness, compassion, and a justice that, this time, listens first. Because justice True justice is not loud. It is not quick. It is not certain. It is slow. It is patient. It is human. And above all, remembers, the trials had ended, the gallows dismantled, the names slowly cleared, but their echoes remained. They drifted through the decades, soft as breath, long as shadow, because stories, when rooted in truth, do not vanish. They become legacy. Salem did not bury its past. It carried it, through whispered memories, through sermons rewritten, through the slow, steady retelling of what happened, and what it meant. At first, the village was quiet. The people wanted to move on. They spoke little of the trials. They planted fields. They married. They built new homes. But beneath those new boards, that old weight remained. Some wounds do not bleed. They settle deep, inside memory. Over the years, the world began to ask, what happened here? Why did they believe? How could it go so far? And with those questions came history. Books were written, first by scholars, then by poets, then by playwrights and teachers. Each sought to understand, to explain, to warn. The name Salem came to mean more than a village. It became a symbol of fear, of injustice, of what happens when belief goes untested, and justice moves too fast. In classrooms, children read the names. They traced the trials on maps. They asked questions the judges once did not. Why were dreams used as evidence? Why didn't someone stop it sooner? How could this happen in a place of faith? In time, literature found Salem. Nathaniel Hawthorne, Arthur Miller, and many others took the past and held it up like a mirror. They used fiction to reflect truth and to show how closely past and present can walk side by side. The Crucible, a play written during a time of political fear, brought Salem into the 20th century. It reminded the world that witch hunts are not always about witches. Sometimes they are about ideas, about control, about the danger of silence. Salem became a place of memory. Visitors came, not just to see where the trials happened, but to feel what they left behind. They walked the paths the accused once walked. They stood in cemeteries, in courtrooms, on hills where truth had once been hanged, and they remembered, not in anger, but in reflection. The town changed too. Museums were built, stones placed, names etched in bronze and granite, no longer hidden, but honored. The descendants of the accused spoke their ancestors' names with pride, not because they were guilty, but because they endured, because they held to truth when the world turned away, because their silence spoke more loudly than any scream. Today, Salem is many things: a town, a story, a caution, a place of learning, a place of memory, a place where history is not buried, but gently displayed, so that each new generation may ask its own questions and listen to the answers that came before. The historical legacy of Salem is not about witches. It is about people, and what fear can do to them, what justice demands of them, what memory can teach them, and how truth, however long it takes, always rises, even from the quietest places, even from the darkest years, even from a small New England village, so many centuries ago. The village is quiet now. The snow has returned. The fire burns low. And the names once whispered in fear now rest gently in memory. You've heard the story, not the loud version, not the one filled with flames and fury, but the quiet one, the one that moves like wind through the trees, like footsteps on fresh snow, the kind of story you can fall asleep to, because it's not just a tale of trials and ropes. It's a story of people, of belief, of what happens when we forget to listen. Once in Salem, fear stood taller than faith. Once silence hurt more than shouts. Once a name spoken too softly could echo into the news. But that was long ago, and though the lessons linger, so too does the peace that followed. The story ends here, not with a scream, but with a breath, a slow, steady breath that says, We remember, we have learned, and we will not forget. So now, as your eyes grow heavy, and your thoughts begin to drift, let this village fade into sleep. Let the gallows dissolve. Let the court fall silent. Let the names settle gently into stillness. Because this story is not about fear anymore. It is about rest. About what comes after. About the quiet strength of truth. Close your eyes. The fields are empty. The sky is clear. And all is calm. Let history rest. And let yourself rest too. Good night. And may peace be with you. The story of Salem did not end in Salem. Its echoes traveled far beyond its frozen fields. Into courts. Into classrooms. Into books, plays, laws, and hearts. Because what happened there was not just a village's mistake. It was a mirror, held up to the world, to ask, what would you do? If fear came softly? If justice moved too fast? If silence became survival? In the years after the trials, countries across oceans watched, not for witches, but for the way truth bent in the wind. How easily doubt can wear the mask of guilt. How quickly innocence is forgotten, when belief becomes law. Writers explored it, historians recorded it, activists studied it, lawmakers invoked it, teachers taught it. It became more than an event. It became a lens. In times of panic, people whispered the name Salem. During purges, during blacklists, during revolutions and reckonings, they looked back, not to copy, but to caution. Because Salem reminds us, we are all vulnerable to the stories we believe, and the silence we allow. Injustice wears many costumes. Sometimes it carries a torch. Sometimes it carries a Bible. Sometimes it carries nothing at all. Just a name spoken in the wrong tone, at the wrong time. But Salem also reminds us that truth survives, even when hidden, even when punished, even when buried beneath shame and fear. It endures, because someone remembers, because someone tells the story, because someone listens. Beyond Salem, new generations have taken the story and asked new questions. What does it mean to accuse? What does it mean to believe? What does it mean to forgive? The answers are not simple. They are not written in stone, but they are worth seeking, because the past is not only behind us. Sometimes it circles back, in new forms, in new fears, and the story of Salem, told slowly, told softly, is a way to remember, to stay awake, against the tide of unthinking, to rest, knowing that even in darkness, some truths still shine. So as the final pages close, and the village of Salem grows still once more, carry the lesson gently, not as burden, but as light, because what was broken can be healed, and what was lost can be remembered, if we choose to remember it, if we choose to listen, and if we choose to speak, when it matters most.